Ann Fischer, Senior Editor of PV Magazine USA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here, live in Brooklyn, New York, to today's event, the PV Magazine Roundtables US 2023. 14 months after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. solar industry is entering a new era of growth and opportunity. The 6 sessions we have planned for you today are centered around the manufacturing renaissance that's just beginning in the U.S. Our 30 expert speakers will be getting into the specifics of bringing manufacturing to the U.S. What type of cells and modules will be produced and why? How to maintain quality and reliability while ramping up capacity. And then we'll peer into the growing residential and grid-scale energy storage markets as well. But first, we'll kick off with a keynote address from Dr. Becca Jones-Albertus, Director of the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office, on the opportunities and risks in U.S. solar manufacturing, followed by a presentation by Bruce Ledesma, President of Nextracker, on onshoring manufacturing. Before diving into the first session, this event wouldn't be possible without the support of the industry. I'd like to thank all of our partners for their contributions for today's program. Special thanks to our lead partner, Nextracker, and platinum partners, Longi and Trina Solar. Thank you to you and to our gold partners for your support. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. She's the director of DOE's Solar Energy Technologies Office. With an annual budget of over $300 million, CETO is advancing solar technology and supporting an equitable transition to a decarbonized energy system. Becca Jones-Albertus has spent her career advancing solar technology and working to reduce barriers for solar deployment. Prior to joining the Energy Department, she worked in the private sector, where she led efforts to develop solar cells that twice achieved world record efficiencies. Welcome, Becca Jones-Albertus.
Good morning. I'm having some audio challenges, so just want to make sure you all can hear me.
We can hear you.
Great, thank you. All right. So before jumping in, just wanted to quickly introduce my office at the U.S. Department of Energy. The Solar Energy Technologies Office focuses on advancing technology and accelerating solar deployment. We do this by driving innovation in both technology, from the solar panel supply chain to inverters to soft costs like siting, permitting, and interconnection to make solar affordable and accessible for all Americans. As we think about scaling up solar from 5% of U.S. electricity today to having solar be the backbone of a clean energy grid, we work to make solar able to support the reliability, the resilience, and the security of the grid. And we focus on how solar can support job growth, equitable opportunities to benefit from a clean energy transition, growth of domestic solar manufacturing, as well as movement toward a circular economy. Big picture as we talk about the solar supply chain here, the U.S. is the second largest market after China for PV deployment, about 12% of global PV demand in 2022. So we're a big focus of the U.S. market and very important player. We have 2 technology types deployed in the U.S. Up until 2022, about 83% of the market was crystalline silicon technology, and about 17% was cadmium telluride, though the cadmium telluride share is growing. Here, as we'll be talking about, the supply chain is just an illustration of those 2 supply chains, with crystalline silicon going from polysilicon through ingot wafer, making cells, turning those into modules, mounting them on structures or trackers, connecting with inverters to provide power. Cadmium telluride supply chain, panel supply chain is simpler, where the module is all fabricated in one step from cadmium telluride powder and other input materials. We've published a paper recently talking about what it takes to get to a reliable supply chain. So in the US, President Biden set a goal of decarbonizing our power grid by 2035. Getting there would require about another 1,000 gigawatts of solar deployment, and having a secure and reliable supply chain is critically important to enabling that goal. And so we're focused on what that means. And a secure supply chain is one that is geographically diverse. It is one that has a large number of, or has corporate diversity and financially healthy companies that can scale their production to meet increasing demand. It's one where we have multiple technologies, supports multiple technologies as we do through cadmium telluride and several different types of crystalline silicon cell technologies. It's also a supply chain that has sufficient scale to continue to drive down costs and achieve those benefits of being economies of scale. And last, there's a government with diversified, consistent, and coordinated support. One of the biggest risks to the supply chain serving the US today is that it is not geographically diverse in all segments. The global solar supply chain is heavily concentrated in China, as many of you know, and you can see from the plot on the left for the silicon supply chain. And this shows the different silicon supply chain segments that have each more than 80% of production in China. Now for the US market, cells and modules come primarily from Southeast Asia, not from China, but the earlier stages of the supply chain are still heavily dominated by Chinese products. And the chart on the right shows the wafer capacity that by year in supply chain. And so what we have seen over the last year or so is some build out of a wafer supply chain outside of China in Southeast Asia to serve the US market. But what you can see is that overall capacity growth in the US is still very heavily dominated. Overall capacity growth in ingot wafer is still heavily dominated in China, even with that development in Southeast Asia. Many other parts of the supply chain, equipment like ingot pullers, input materials, frames, glass, and metal for mounting structures also come substantially from China. We at DOE are really focused on how we can help support and build a US supply chain as one of the key strategies for having a more resilient supply chain. Having a domestic supply chain that supplies a significant fraction of demand is not only a great strategy for having a secure and reliable supply chain, it also brings tremendous additional benefits to the US, from manufacturing jobs to economic growth and beyond. And so that is certainly a focus. Historically, I think as many of us know, but just quantified by this figure, we've been relying on imports across the supply chain to serve a lot of so here, the line in the dark purple is annual PV installations. The bars are the different supply chain segments, purple being thin film in the solar supply chain. And what you can see is, at the 10 years ago point, we did have significant polysilicon production in the US until the AD/CVD tariffs implemented by China on US polysilicon caused that production to fall substantially. And through all other segments of the supply chain, we have much less production, no production in the case of wafers and cells compared to what we're installing. In 2021, we manufactured in this country just 17% of the modules that were installed here. But that is all poised to change with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most significant piece of legislation we've had in this country when it comes to domestic solar manufacturing. So through the manufacturing production tax credits, through the domestic content adder, we're seeing support manufacturing growth across the supply chain. We know that the reason the numbers of domestic manufacturing were so low on the prior slide, prior to 2021, the passage of IRA, are because we do have higher costs in this country for things like labor, electricity, land acquisition. We have higher permitting and environmental burdens, all for very good reason. And we have smaller supply chains, but all those contribute to higher costs. The tax credits provided by the Inflation Reduction Act at each segment of the supply chain offer an opportunity to really equalize those costs and make it US market competitive. And what we've seen in response is an incredible number of manufacturing announcements across the supply chain. They're illustrated here at the bottom for the silicon supply chain, polysilicon and wafers and cells, to PV modules, which includes both cadmium and telluride and silicon, to inverters, module parts, tools, racking, and tracking, all of which are substantial growth over where we were prior to IRA. The yellow bar represents estimates of US PV deployment in 2025, and you can see that we have module announcements that are double or triple expected near-term deployment, but of course we're expecting deployment to grow year over year. We have cells that are roughly in that realm, but still the other elements of the supply chain are not there. So it is incredibly exciting, these numbers of announcements cumulatively across the supply chain. It's over 210 gigawatts of capacity. It's over 20,000 jobs, nearly $12 billion in investments, 66 new facilities or expansions across 23 states in the U.S. and Puerto Rico. And so it's a very significant change in this landscape. And of course, not all of these announcements may be realized, but there may also be additional announcements to come, and there may be some facilities that grow beyond what they're initially announcing. So we're poised to have a very significant domestic supply chain, and really hoping that we can grow that to a supply chain that can be fully self-sufficient for a significant share of U.S. solar demand. As we, onshore all of this manufacturing and build to a 30 to 50 gigawatt full supply chain, we will need partnerships with foreign companies to transfer technology, build know-how in here, and we are seeing some of those developing already. So a secure supply chain, we really want to be a supply chain that's secure at all segments. And so in black here, you see silicon metal, cell, and module segments, which are areas where we may be in a position to fully supply our near-term deployment needs, but still manufacturing equipment, raw materials, consumables, polysilicon, ingot, wafer, we may not have sufficient U.S. supply. So still to support growth in all of those areas, and really all of those links are critical to build the most secure and reliable supply chain we can have. Wanted to end here just with what DOE is doing to support these investments. The Solar Energy Technologies Office supports through a number of different programs. We provide support all the way from innovators and entrepreneurs who have a brand new technology idea, all the way through folks who have developed their technology and are looking for pilot scale manufacturing support. This pipeline can prepare new technologies to be ready to apply to our loan programs office for a loan guarantee to scale into full production. And the best, we have a few examples here of recent funding from the solar office in the tens of millions of dollars to support the silicon and film supply chains, as well as our incubator program, which supports a diversity of new companies developing products that's in the sector. The best way to find out about all of these opportunities as they're coming out is through our newsletter, which is energy.gov/solar-newsletter. And if you go to our website, you will also find we have a lot of resources on the Inflation Reduction Act itself, as well as across the government. There are additional resources in order to learn more about the tremendous benefits and opportunities that come through IRA. And I will close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Becca. It's great to hear about the Department of Energy's strong support for building a reliable and secure supply chain in the U.S. Nextracker, a leading solar tracker supplier, partners with manufacturers all around the U.S. to alleviate supply chain concerns and shipping volatility. Bruce Ledesma, president of Nextracker, is joining us this morning with insights on domestic manufacturing. As president of Nextracker, Bruce oversees corporate development strategy and administration. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So what I'd like to do is present a brief history of Nextracker's experience onshoring in the U.S., both in the period leading up to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act as well as our response in the wake of that historic legislation. So let me share a slideshow on this. Is that presenting okay? Great. So just a brief snapshot of our company to kick it off. Well, we are a global provider of PV tracking systems and associated software solutions. We've been the leading provider both in the US and globally for several consecutive years now. And you can see some of our key metrics here on the slide, as well as a depiction of our office locations throughout the world. And a tracker, for those who are not aware, is a system that is used largely in the utility scale market. And it mounts the panels and rotates them throughout the day to follow the arc of the sun as it crosses the sky. And by doing so, produce up to 25% more power than would otherwise occur if the panel stayed in a stationary position. And you can see the equipment there in the center of the slide. It's the tracker system sits atop the piers and runs horizontally through the entire tracker row. And there are multiple components to the system. And this is an important point in terms of the IRA incentives, because both when looking at the 45X advanced manufacturing credits, as well as the project owner-facing ITC and PTC credit boosts that come with domestic content, there's a component-level analysis on where those components are being manufactured, and that's true for not only the tractors, of course, but modules and inverters and other manufactured products. Our supply chain network is global, so we actually don't make the components in our own factories. We outsource the manufacturing to a web of partners throughout the world. And this has served us well for a variety of reasons. Doing localized in-region manufacturing allows us to stay close to where the projects are occurring and build the components in proximity to the customers, so that promotes on-time delivery. It also gives us agility from a perspective of macro factors that may come into play. So, for example, during the pandemic, when shipping logistics costs spiked to historic levels, it was helpful to have regional manufacturing to avoid some of those costs, or COVID factory shutdowns in certain countries, or tariffs that might surface to apply, for example, obviously, to Chinese exports coming into the US. So this has served us well, and we are committed to having a global framework. But most of our business is in the US, and in the wake of some of those pandemic era experiences, we started to pivot prior to IRA into US manufacturing. So here you see our first factory announcement in May of 22, right outside of Corpus Christi. We have a facility in partnership with JM Steel, and the factory here is supporting mostly projects in Texas and surrounding states. Shortly thereafter, we rolled out a factory in Phoenix with our partner Atcor. And many of the folks that are working in our factories are starting their first jobs in renewables. So it's a great a way to reach folks who may not be familiar with the sector and may need to be trained up in their local communities in a rapid way, which I'll talk about here. So this is our third factory announcement prior to IRA. And it's fairly significant. It drew a lot of attention. We opened this facility right outside of Pittsburgh in a historic but long, shuttered factory that used to produce military equipment during World War II. It's known as the Bethlehem Steel Manufacturing Campus. It had gone dormant for decades, and we were able to reopen it to great fanfare. You can see in the picture U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm holding the scissors with next to our CEO Dan Sugar. And I want to pause here briefly to point out a distinction, or some level of distinction, between the tracker sector and other parts of the solar supply chain in terms of the complexity. So I think we all know that elements of the solar supply chain do involve complicated manufacturing fabs, like the solar cell, which may take 2 to 3 years to build out following a decision, and require fairly technical, highly trained skills on the manufacturing process steps in the factory. In contrast, trackers, a lot of tracker components, which are steel in nature, lend themselves to being located in existing but potentially dormant steel manufacturing facilities around the country, in rural communities where there's sufficient warehouse space, in economically depressed communities. We can rapidly deploy new manufacturing in a matter of months, not years, and we can bring in folks who need to, who may not possess, highly trained skills. So this is how we're contributing, and we think it's a meaningful impact. Then, of course, in August of 22, IRA was passed, and included in it was domestic tracker manufacturing incentives. So I know our next panel will go deeper on the specifics of the IRA incentives, but just to highlight the two main drivers for onshoring tracker manufacturing, both our partner suppliers who are making the components are receiving tax credits for the torque tube, which is the heaviest steel component of our system, and structural fasteners. And quite importantly, some of these folks don't have adequate tax appetite to fully absorb the tax credits made available. So 45X does have transferability and direct pay, actually, which is critically important, and we're very happy to see it in there. With respect to the ITC and PTC bonus credits, the 10% adders, again, that is our customer-facing incentives, but it's a demand pull for us to deliver more domestic manufactured components so they can claim the credit. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the way that works is you look at the component level of the product, whether you're talking about the panel, the inverter, the tracker, and you're classifying each component into buckets of either made in the US or not made in the US. And currently, when you aggregate all those components together in a single fraction, at the moment, you need at least 40% of those costs together with labor costs getting you to that level. So this was an accelerant for us. So we were starting to migrate into the US, but we picked up the pace once the IRA was passed. And so today we have over 25 gigawatts of contracted capacity for our primary components in over 10 facilities. We have new lines coming on for other components in the tracker system. You see a picture here of a factory announcement in Memphis, Tennessee. And another great thing is we're using US steel for our primary components, and that tends to be cleaner steel than outside the US, because most of our steel mill partners are using electric arc furnace technology, which has up to 75% less carbon emissions than traditional blast furnaces. So that's nicely aligned with our mission and ESG goals. For those of you who are at RE+, yet another factory announcement for Nextracker right down the street during the trade show, this time with our partner Unimax. And we don't just do steel component manufacturing. We do have complex manufacturing. This is our controller, which is the brains of our system, the computer unit that sits on each tracker row, processing data to perfect the angle of the panels. And this does involve, you can see on the left here, a little more sophistication in the manufacturing environment. And we're committed to doing that here as well. This is with our partner, Steel Flash, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So to recap, as my final slide, this is showing the icons here are showing the factories that we've publicly announced that I just reviewed, but those are only the ones we've announced. So we don't issue a press release on every factory. We have another 15 facilities which have opened or expanded just between last year and this year. And so we're quite pleased to be part of the American job creation, permanent jobs for manufacturing, part of the story on energy independence for the country and building localized resilience in our solar supply chain. And I know we're just one company of many doing this. I did read, I think SIA put out data showing that over 150 gigawatts of new manufacturing capacity has been announced in the wake of IRA. So quite pleased to be part of the story, and thank you for letting me tell it.
Thank you, Bruce, for sharing Nextracker's innovative and ambitious approach to onshoring, smoothing the supply chain, and shipping challenges.
Great, thank you.
Our first panel discussion will address how the IRA is challenging the solar PV manufacturing landscape. Once again, I'm Ann Fischer, Senior Editor of PV Magazine USA, and I will be the moderator of this discussion. I'll begin by acknowledging the incredible effect that the Inflation Reduction Act is having on the U.S. solar industry, the largest climate and energy package in U.S. history. The bill includes $600 billion in spending, $370 billion of which is dedicated to supporting renewable energy build-out. Here we are 14 months later, and the build-out has begun. Nearly 70 companies have announced plans to set up solar manufacturing in the U.S., yet uncertainties abound and questions remain. Our panel of experts is here to discuss U.S. solar manufacturing, potential supply chain gaps, uncertainties around domestic content guidance, and more. Let me introduce our four experts on this important panel. Mark Delaney is a Senior Vice President of Global Sourcing at Invenergy, LLC, with nearly 12 years of experience in the energy industry across multiple sectors, including wind, solar, energy storage, and natural gas. Eli Hinckley is a partner in Baker Bott's Washington, D.C. office, where he focuses on assisting clients in navigating the challenging energy, tax, and financial landscape. Christian Roselund leads policy research and communication at Clean Energy Associates, including issues of trade, supply chain, and national policies. MJ Shiao has worked in the clean energy sector for 15 years and is currently Vice President of Supply Chain and Manufacturing for the American Clean Power Association. So welcome, let's set the stage. Christian, I'll start with you. What capacity is expected to be manufactured in the US as opposed to announced, and when, from modules all the way up to polysilicon?
Thank you so much, Ann. So, this is an interesting time because we're seeing so many of these really exciting announcements. Unfortunately, not everything that's announced gets built. And right now, CEA is tracking 120 gigawatts of crystal and silicon module announcements. Notably, when I give these figures, this does not count thin film. We are expecting First Solar to expand from 6 gigawatts to 15 gigawatts in the United States by the year in 2027. So among that 120 gigawatts of module announcements and around 70 gigawatts of crystalline silicon cell announcements, we're expecting only 50 gigawatts of module capacity and 18 gigawatts of cell capacity by year in 27. So about 40% of the module capacity and about a quarter of the cell capacity. For ingot and wafer, there is only one player that has announced ingot and wafer that we think is likely to build that and have that online by year in 2027. So we're only looking at about 3 gigawatts there. The others are just not very well positioned to be able to pull this off in that time frame. For polysilicon, as noted by Dr. Becca Jones-Albertus, there are no greenfield polysilicon plants that have been announced. We are anticipating the restart of the RE Silicon plant in Washington State. Even there are additional investments that have needed to be made, timelines have needed to be modified, and I would say for any project of this scale, delays and cost overruns are the norm, not the exception. So, in general, when we hear about all of these announcements, I would say that the timelines are generally optimistic, bordering on overly optimistic, and that there are likely to be delays. And, a lot of this capacity is frankly not, we haven't seen the things that need to be in place for it to come online in the first place.
How many of the announced cell and module factories have already started construction?
So that's an interesting question. And, without driving around to each site and looking, we haven't really been able to answer that. But we've come up with what we think is a really good proxy. And that is the factories for which tools have been delivered. Right now, there are 7 new module factories where tools, at least some of the tools have been delivered. So, we're looking forward to those 7 module factories coming online in the next few years. That's quite exciting. We don't have any record of tools being delivered for any of the cell factories yet. And I would say that there is a concern because there's been a lot of promises for cell capacity coming online. Particularly, this is a concern if you're trying to access that domestic content bonus. Right now, there isn't really a great pathway to do that without either a First Solar module or a cell. And so we're only seeing a couple of relatively small factories that we expect for cell to be online by the end of 2025.
Okay, so MJ, what will the industry do about the gaps in the supply chain? And do you anticipate continued reliance on China to fill those gaps?
Yeah, that's a good question. And first of all, thanks to PV Magazine for having me on this panel. I think Christian summed up some of the gaps that we're seeing in the supply chain already. The manufacturing tax credits and the environment that we've built have spurred a lot of announcements, a lot of intent to build new solar manufacturing facilities in the US. But where we are seeing the concentration of those announcements is generally on the module side, the cell side, and again, very few on the wafer and almost no greenfield and very few expansions on the polysilicon side. So in terms of where we will fill those gaps, I think we have to look at 2 scenarios. One is what we think will happen or what will happen in a business as usual if we just kind of ride on the environment we have now, and what we want to or we think should happen with the supply chain. And I think both are important to talk about. If we look at what will happen, I think Christian and his team at CEA have summarized it well. We'll have kind of a very downstream heavy manufacturing space, and we'll have to continue to rely on foreign partners, imports to bring that polysilicon ingot wafer and much of the cell into the US. And that is kind of an environment that we can have, but I think as Americans, we have an opportunity to lead again in the energy sector. We've certainly done that with traditional energy sources. We have an opportunity to do that in new energy, although we have a lot of catching up to do. And in order to do that, to control our destiny on future energy deployments, particularly in renewable energy, we really need to push this industry to focus on, and the policy world to focus on giving the market both time and market certainty to build those upstream pieces of the supply chain. In particular, it can take 3 to 5 years to build new polysilicon manufacturing. And if you, for example, look at where we have the manufacturing tax credits incentives for polysilicon, by the time a new greenfield polysilicon plant can access those, it's already halfway through the incentive time period and it's already stepping down. And that's not driving the market certainty that those polysilicon suppliers need. Furthermore, just looking at the demand, we are starting from scratch. We're thinking about building this big vertically integrated supply chain in the US where we've had very little of it in the past decade. So, the first step is to concentrate, really build the downstream demand that goes to projects and ensuring we have a steady stream of projects that goes to the project tax credits, that goes to permitting, that goes to interconnection, build that demand, start building the demand in terms of executing on these module facilities, making sure maybe not all these announcements will come online, but that we have, core set of competitive, stable manufacturers on module manufacturing, and then again, start to look at how we can spur more of that upstream part of the supply chain in poly ingot wafer cells, etc.
Okay, so MJ, a further question. What happens to our supply chain if we're not manufacturing ingots and wafers in the US and they're detained under UFLPA at the border?
So that's an interesting question, right? There's been a lot of focus on ingots and wafers for the solar supply chain, in particular right now because just geographically, over 95% of that production capacities is centered in China. And with any kind of global supply chain situation, there's a lot of risk of disruption when you have that kind of over reliance, over concentration in one geography. So I think when you're asking about what happens if we don't make ingot wafers here and UFLPA, they are slightly different but related topics, obviously. So the first of all, we have these new tariffs in the form of the conclusion of the Oxen investigation over the past couple of years, where there is now, because of the tariff environment, some push to have wafers being built outside of China. That in particular seems to be concentrated in Southeast Asia, centered around where there is cell demand, cell production, where the customers are right there for those new ingot wafer producers. And so if we don't do anything here to, again, look at the gaps that are necessary to, and really solve the gaps for US ingot wafer producers, then we'll continue to rely on those imports. Now, UFLPA is a broader discussion, and that stretches back all the way beyond the ingot wafer down to where the quartz is being mined, in particular, having none of the supply chain really touching, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is the area of concern that's spelled out in the legislation. In that realm, we have seen the supply chain for solar really put a lot of investment in capacity, production, sourcing outside the region, to the point where much of the polysilicon that we now see, or all the polysilicon we generally see, is not being sourced in the Xinjiang region, and much more of the polysilicon that is being built into ingot wafers that eventually come to the US in the form of cells or modules is being even sourced out of the US. Now, the concern is whether non-China polysilicon capacity will actually be enough to long-term source and be have enough capacity for all of U.S. deployments, and if that is continued to be kind of looked at as the safest route or the least risky route, then again, similar to what we've talked about, we as a country, we as the American solar industry, have to think about ways that we can give more market certainty and better, just a better economic environment for non-Chinese polysilicon producers to expand. Otherwise, we'll continue to see a lot of the Chinese players who are already working towards how they get to, again, a non-Xinjiang based sourcing solution, and then continuing to have that polysilicon reach the U.S. and eventually we'll find the right set of documentation sources to move through the customs process if it is detained.
Thank you, MJ. Mark, let me ask, from your perspective, would it make sense for the U.S. To try to cut ourselves off from the global trading system for PV modules? Is it even possible?
Sure. So I'd also like to thank PV Magazine for the opportunity to be on this panel. You have me following MJ on this one, so that's a tough act to follow, but I'll give it a shot here. So I think there's been a couple things that have been expressed here that I think are relevant to this question, and really we're talking a lot about the ingot pooling, wafer slicing, and polysilicon manufacturing portion of the supply chain, and the amount of capacity that is going to be needed in the U.S. in order to catch up with demand, to catch up with forecasted domestic module manufacturing capacity. That's going to take time, right? And I think this has been alluded to a couple times during the presentation, but you're looking at a couple years to get a cell manufacturing facility online. Ingot pulling, wafer slicing, polysilicon, I think MJ's cited 3 to 5 years, and you're also going to have different timelines depending on where you're developing. Different areas are going to be, I'll say, more friendly from a permitting standpoint, from a construction standpoint for these really heavy construction projects. So I think when you look at the work that needs to be done on that end of the supply chain versus the runway of the IRA, again, I think MJ alluded to this as well. The IRA provides a 10-year runway on incentives. It is going to take more time than that, in my opinion, to get to a point where even if you wanted to effectively isolate the supply chain here in the U.S., you're looking at a longer runway than what the IRA affords. Now, another point that was raised that I'd like to mention in terms of answering the direct question is, would we want to do this? You then get into the question and the risk of over reliance on one geographical region. I think, as MJ put it, right? For a lot of these companies that are going to be looking to make these heavy capital investments, in U.S. manufacturing, they're going to want, as would anybody, offtake certainty, right? And as we all know, the U.S. solar market can be a little volatile sometimes, right? So, I think they're going to be wanting to make sure that they have, I'll say, exportation opportunities in the event of softness in the U.S. market at a particular time. And I think the U.S. solar market is going to want to make sure that it has an opportunity to rely on importations if you have a year of very high demand. I kind of go back to MJ's comment on this one, that risk of a single geographical sourcing region.
Yeah, good point, Mark.
Yeah, does anyone want to add to that?
Sure. I think that one of the dangers that we get into when we start building for U.S. supply for the U.S. market, I think Mark made a really important point there, which is you're basically right now the U.S. market is paying more than double for PV modules what is being paid in Europe and what is being paid in other parts of the world. So if you're betting that you're going to be able to sell into that high price market, what happens if market conditions change? That's a big risk that we're asking manufacturers to take. And I think this is part of the unanticipated and unappreciated dangers of trying to sort of ring fence off the US market from the rest of the global supply, which we see through our combination of trade and industrial policies.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think Christian said it well, right? There certainly one way that we have done for the past decade plus of trying to spur manufacturing, which is basically to launch a bunch of tariffs, and that increases the cost price of serving the US market. That creates the higher price environment, but at the end of the day, the competitors that are able to build and sell into that market, they just have a higher cost structure and they're not competitive outside of the US market. What we need to do is we need to build through a combination of investment, incentives, trying to take more control of the supply chain, the IP itself, and where the technology is headed, build and encourage more competitive manufacturing in the US that can also be competitive outside of the US in order to have a sustainable manufacturing landscape. That's really easy to say, incredibly hard to do, and decades of, frankly, continued support, investment, and focus on that exact end goal.
But if I can piggyback on that really important point, MJ, you point to our history of trade policy and industrial policy. I think it's really important to note that the IRA is a sea change in that we're using industrial policy for the first time, words that were not even frankly spoken in DC 6 years ago. We're suddenly talking about using industrial policy to provide carrots and not just sticks to do things in the United States, because the record of sticks, the record of imposing trade barriers, is that did not effectively build US manufacturing capacity. We are seeing US manufacturing capacity now, in large part, because of the incentives. And I'll let Elias speak a little bit to that. But we're not seeing it because we put up trade barriers. I've heard this claim be made on other webinars recently, and the track record clearly shows that the trade barriers did not result in significant additional US manufacturing capacity.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that tariffs are having an effect, right? This is a carrot and stick. You've got both a push and a pull happening here to try to drive manufacturing. And if you're pushing up the relative cost to imported products, right, it's going to make it easier to see a place that's you're competitive with your domestically produced product. And then if you can subsidize that domestically produced product, presumably you get underneath that price point and you break things down. The question becomes, like, subsidies are expensive for taxpayers and politically challenging. And we see it with 45X, which has a limited window. We see it with 48 Cap C, the advanced manufacturing credit, which has a limited pool of dollars. It's unclear how much you can directly reduce the actual manufacturing cost for these products in the US. And then you've got a further pull, which is additional value for using the US product in your project. And all these things help, but it's a lot of moving pieces, and there remains some uncertainty both with how these things are actually applied and how durable some of these incentives are. And so where exactly the needle lands in terms of what price point we can hit with US manufacturing, I think is an unanswerable question at this moment in time. But if one of you guys wants to take a shot at that, I'd be fascinated.
Eli, I was going to ask you, for manufacturers setting up shop in the US, what are some of the critical challenges at this point?
So I think Mark alluded to the fact that there are a lot of different geographies, and the relative difficulty of building manufacturing capacity by state, it ranges quite a bit. Some states are much more friendly to manufacturing policy and permitting than others. Relative cost of labor varies by market quite a bit. So the first step is to identify a geography that practically makes sense from a cost structure standpoint in terms of how to actually each project is built, and then from a logistics standpoint. And I think Bruce talked to this a little bit, sort of how they're thinking about the U.S. market and where they're deploying their new factories. So that's piece one. Piece two is to start to understand this support structure landscape, right? So you've got the market-driven side, which is what's your pace of growth? What's the relative cost of competitive product coming in from outside? And that's driven in part by the tariff structures. But then ultimately, you've got to figure out how much you can leverage government funding to bring down your cost structure at that place where you decide to build. And there you've got sort of a variety of different pieces you're looking at. There are two different advanced manufacturing credits. One is production-based and will catch a lot of your solar production, but it's limited in its run, right? It starts to phase down as soon as 2030. If we're talking about timelines to actually get your production capacity up and running in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that the value of that tax credit diminishes pretty quickly. Alternatively, you can look at the other advanced manufacturing credit, which is the 48C credit, which is an investment-based credit. It's a 30% credit against your investment of your manufacturing facility, but that's a limited pool of dollars and it's a competitive application process. We don't have a ton of insight into how the government is evaluating things that might otherwise qualify for the 45 CapEx credit that are looking for 48C as a backup or an alternative. We should start to get more insight into that over the balance of the year. But right now, we know there are some that are sort of taking let's put our finger in both pies to see what looks best, which clouds the water for everybody else. So that's piece one, is to figure out sort of that piece of your sort of manufacturing subsidy structure. Piece two would be to look at, are there other programs that can support the capital structure for our project? And you look at things like the loan guarantee program, where we can tap into lower cost capital, longer tenor capital that might have a little less sensitivity to some of the price swings that we've talked about in the market, both from expansion of U.S. capacity, but also thinking about sort of how the tariffs shake out and where imports are coming from. And so that's a place you can look and you work through that process. You probably need quite a bit of scale for that program to make sense. And then ultimately, you've got to define your market, right? And understanding sort of what the competitive landscape looks like, both from a direct pricing standpoint and how much benefit you can get by being able to tap into the domestic content rules, which are a significant sort of bump in the value of the tax credits for the project side, right? So if I'm building a solar project, it's an extra 10% of credit. That's effectively a 10% reduction in the capex to build that project. That's a meaningful target to hit for just the product side. So there are a whole bunch of pieces, and I think the process for somebody looking at the U.S. market to manufacture is triangulating all those and really building a value proposition that makes sense, sort of on how all of those will affect their ultimate cost structure and the value proposition they have in the market.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think you've touched on my next question, which was, what are some of the biggest challenges to securing the domestic content requirement? But I'd also like to hear a little bit more about the 45X versus 45C, what they are briefly, and the difference between the two.
Sure. The main difference between 45, well, there are a couple of main differences between 45X and 45C. 45X is a brand new credit that was created with Inflation Reduction Act. And it's a production-based credit, and so it actually pays a dollar basis, penny basis, on the production of defined products. And so there's a whole list of specific things, and then a whole bunch of specific mineral extraction that the actual production of that thing gets you paid on a unit basis, and it generates a tax credit on a unit basis. That also has the benefit of being able to tap into one of the monetization tools we've also added under Inflation Reduction Act, which is the direct pay approach, which allows you to not necessarily be a taxpayer as long as you're able to file a U.S. tax return. You can get direct funds from the government and not have to worry about monetizing through some other mechanism which has higher value in the market. So that's 45X. On the other side is 45C, which is a pre-existing credit, but only operates when there have been funds appropriated for it. And so it had a pool of funds in 2010-11, which were mostly allocated. There was some reallocation because people dropped out of the program, and there was a separate allocation done in 2013. There was an additional appropriation done for that 48C credit in Inflation Reduction Act. So there's an additional $10 billion bucket to support manufacturing. And that's going to be a catch-all for anything that sort of lives underneath advanced manufacturing, specifically related to energy technologies. It's a 30% investment credit. And so if you spend $1 billion to build a facility, presumably you can get a $300 million credit. But $10 billion gets used up pretty quickly in this market because you're not just competing with other solar and solar-related manufacturers. It's everybody, right? Somebody building an electrolyzer production facility, somebody building some sort of EV manufacturing facility, they're also chasing these dollars. And so it's a very competitive process. If you get an allocation, that 30% credit is meaningful, but it's an investment-based credit one time, and it's realized when the facility is placed in service. So it's effectively a reduction in your capital costs as opposed to a production-based credit, which supports revenue along the way. It also, because it's an investment-based credit and not subject to the direct pay rules, is you need to be either a U.S. taxpayer with the ability to utilize that against your tax liability, or you've got to either structurally or through the new transfer rules monetize that credit some other way, and there's some reduction in the relative value as you go through that. So that's the sort of difference between those two. For the 48C, the advanced manufacturing credit on that side, we've got most of the rules in place, and we've had the first round of initial submissions for concept papers. We haven't heard back on those yet. For 45X, we're still waiting on rules for that. The legislation is actually pretty well structured, and we see people moving forward with that as it stands, but there's still some uncertainty in the rule process. And this has been an issue for all of the Inflation Reduction Act pieces, right? We're waiting for further guidance to sort of refine exactly how we build out the agreements that drive these transactions that are leveraging Inflation Reduction Act dollars. So that's where those pieces sit. And then the first part of your question, which was domestic content, we got an initial cut on rules in May. There will be a revised set of rules via regulation or proposed regulation comments and final regulation sometime. We don't know when. The thought had been maybe this year, but given sort of the backlog and how everything else is stacking up on the guidance side, probably not until next year. And the biggest challenge there, I would say there's two parts to it. One is the rules as they're structured are very complex. And so just trying to figure out how you identify whether or not you've met the domestic content threshold is a real challenge in the market. There are different approaches. It's iron and steel on one side, which is and sort of how you identify whether or not that's domestically produced, and then you've got the component aspect, which whether or not your product meets the qualification is a mathematical calculation, and that brings in the second part of the challenge there. It's cost-driven calculation, and so you actually need some visibility into the manufacturer's cost structure to understand whether or not some components will meet domestic content, and that's not easy information to get as the owner, who's the person who will get the value of that tax credit. And so as we try to figure out sort of how those pieces work together, that's a really big challenge. Even where we think, I'm not seeing much in the solar space, but as we see people try to tap into that domestic content bonus, it's really hard to find a way to agree that you have certainty that you've met that. And so how you're entering into these agreements between suppliers and owners, or suppliers, EPCs and owners, has been a real challenge.
Okay, great. Now I'd like to turn to the developer's point of view. And Mark, how realistic is it that a developer can qualify for all of the adders?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think I would echo some of the challenges, that were just mentioned as it relates to the guidance that was released, earlier in May. I think one of the biggest things that sticks out to me, and I don't want to get too far into the details of the guidance, but basically, if you look at the module, for example, the way it's structured is, a module is considered an applicable project component, and then it has multiple what are called manufactured product components, or MPCs, underneath it. And basically, at the end of the day, to figure out, what the module can contribute, you effectively have to add up all of the domestically produced MPCs. And if you look at what that list is, it's pretty, it's pretty extensive. There's cells, which we've talked about at length here, but there's also glass and junction boxes and encapsulants and, a couple others that are going to take a little bit of time, I think, to establish, manufacturing in the U.S. So, I think getting to the point where you're able to fully qualify, fully take credit in your numerator for a domestically produced module, that's going to take a little bit of time. And as I think we all know, the module is a substantial piece of the overall capital cost of a project. So if you don't have the module, it becomes significantly more challenging to meet that threshold. the other challenge that we have is that the threshold increases, increases as time goes on. So, we talk about a 40% threshold, but we should note that applies for projects that start construction in 23 and 24. It increases, I can't remember exactly, but I think it goes up to 55% by 2027 in say 5% increments. So as time goes on, you're going to need to be able to incorporate more and more of the equipment that you buy, in the numerator. I think also as of right now, the guidance that has been released lends itself to some uncertainty around what's included in that numerator. It lists out a number of
Yes.
components that you would say should be included. It's the tracker, it's the inverter, it's the module. But there's a note that the table is non-exhaustive. So, it's not really clear. It's not really clear whether or not, say, like an inverter has, MPCs or not. So, I think with clearer guidance, there's a lot of movement in the industry, regardless of, type of equipment you're talking about to bring manufacturing to the U.S. I mean, everybody here just, heard Bruce over at Nextracker give a great presentation on all the work they're doing to bring manufacturing here. We've been talking about modules. So in a practical sense, I think you're going to have availability. You're going to have a pool of this equipment that should give you the credit you're looking for in the numerator. But kind of going back to the challenges with the current guidance, how that's actually calculated, how you can really show that something is domestic or not, those are still questions that need to be ironed out.
And the other piece of that is challenging is that there's a value construct, right? If I'm producing domestically manufactured components to go into your system, I'm creating additional value for you because you're going to meet that domestic content requirement. But I won't be the only party adding value. And so we're seeing a lot of friction around how that value is divided up, and ultimately probably doesn't have a material effect for many of the developers when you actually break down the sort of final sharing that you end up doing. But Mark, you may be seeing something different. I know we've seen people push back and be like, it doesn't make any sense. Everybody wants a piece, and we end up with nothing in risk or very little in risk.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's interesting because every single one of our clients would like to claim the domestic content adder, but I don't know how many actually, under the current interim guidance, will be able to. And the biggest problem that we see is this direct costs construct. Manufacturers don't want to share their direct costs with their customers. So until that changes, I think that that's a number one barrier. And then you have the other barrier. Look, what I just mentioned about cells. Until 2025 at a minimum, unless you have first solar product, good luck getting there. And it is helpful that we have other components such as, the great stuff that Nextracker has done and their high degree of domestic content that they're able to add to it. But unfortunately, the module is a big part of the overall cost structure, and the cell is the biggest by far part of the module. So without that piece in there, it's really challenging.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting close on time. So my final question was going to be to ask each of you for a quick takeaway on what our audience should be taking away, whether they're a manufacturer or developer, from what we've discussed today. So can I hear from each of you? Why don't we start with Mark?
Sure. So, I think a couple takeaways. We spent a lot of time, rightfully so, talking about, the need to establish, your from a module standpoint, your domestic polysilicon production, ingot wafering production as well. In order to really build that holistic supply chain here in the U.S. For the solar market, we touched on this a little bit, but another point I would add on the module side is, we're all excited about domestic manufacturing of modules, right? I think we can all agree. I think we can all agree on that. But there is so much diligence and risk that needs to be done as a purchaser in this market, whether you're talking about supply chain risk, whether you're talking about trade or policy risk. We need to keep in mind that the inputs to these modules, i.e. the cells, are still being imported from overseas over the next couple of years. So we need to understand things like, come, June 5th, I believe it is, anything that's, any module or really any cell that's imported in the U.S. Based on the Oxen petition is going to be subject to AD/CVD should it come from one of those 4 countries. So buyers really need to understand, where the wafers coming from, where the cells coming from, all the normal diligence you would be doing if you were importing a module from, say, Southeast Asia. I think that's what I got.
All right, thanks. Eli, quick 1 minute response.
Sure, I'll be quick. I think it's finding a way to navigate the uncertainties that allow you to get to a place where you've got some comfort, whether you're a buyer or a seller in this market. And there are a number of them, they're challenging. And so understanding that it's going to take you some time and work to get to a place where you'll have comfort that you understand sort of what your opportunity and risk match is. I think that's probably the biggest challenge facing everybody in this market right now, sort of across the board.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Okay, MJ?
Sure. I think the takeaway here for folks is that the work isn't done. There's still a lot in terms of implementing the IRA. There's looking beyond the IRA and how we can continue to support and encourage more domestic manufacturing. We as an industry, we came together 2 years ago, and we helped this government pass one of the most ambitious climate policies, full of the tax credits and the other supports we're talking about now. And we need to continue to work together, band together, really focus on how we can continue to move forward and continue that investment in this clean energy future.
Okay, great. And Christian?
Thanks. I'm going to step out and go a little bit big picture here. Great comments, by the way, from my fellow panelists. I think there's been this big push to onshore the US PV supply chain. And I think that that's as MJ said, that's a very big task, and our work is not done. In particular, we have this dependence on China. Globally, we have a dependence on China for certain parts of the supply chain. I think that there's some impatience among policymakers to just, let's just move everything here and we'll just be done with it. But that's a big task, and it's a difficult task, and the tools that we have right now do not allow us to become fully independent of China for certain aspects of the supply chain. For key portions, we are dependent on China and Chinese companies in Southeast Asia, and we will continue to be dependent on them for the foreseeable future. I think that needs to be taken into account when policies like this are made. And in particular, I want to note that I heard a claim on a recent webinar that the UFLPA was helping to build US manufacturing. I've actually found the opposite. We've had a major ingot and wafer maker come to us and talk about putting a factory in the United States. And their concern was, well, will our polysilicon be stopped when we import it? Because there's not enough non-China polysilicon to feed our factory. So we'll have to get it from China. And so this process of decoupling, I don't think we fully examined enough the possibility of friendshoring in addition to onshoring. But second, when we talk about the onshoring portion, we have to realize that this is going to have to be a step-by-step process, and that it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of policy support, and that some of the policies that we're putting in place now, instead of supporting that goal, are actually working against that goal of trying to relocate, trying to re-onshore in the United States. And I think that there's a degree of nuance here that has to be considered that unfortunately I see missing in a lot of the discussions about this, not as much in this industry, but in DC.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time. So thank you, Mark, Eli, Christian, and MJ for taking the time today to share your expertise with us. Thank you so much. In our first panel, we learned from our experts about some challenges such as ongoing supply chain issues, questions about IRA adders. We also heard that the opportunities presented by the IRA are huge, and the benefits are just beginning to be realized. Next up is our session, Cell and Module Production. What technologies will lead and why? We'll welcome experts from Trina Solar, Exawatt, PV Evolution Labs, DNV, and Estuary Power to discuss the latest module developments and examine the technologies at the front and center of the IRA investment. We have a short break coming up, but before that, just a few pointers on the event itself. Our program is tightly packed today, but don't hesitate to post your questions in our live chat. They will not be addressed today, but we always want to hear from you. If you want to spread the word about the event, what we've been discussing and will debate, don't hesitate to use the hashtag RTUS23. If you haven't done so, feel free to explore our event platform. You can network with industry peers by using the one-to-one matchmaking feature, send a direct message, or initiate live chats with other attendees. You can also engage in discussions hosted by some of our partners at their virtual booths. There you'll also find resource materials available for downloading. Specifically, our partner CEA is hosting a networking lounge and looks forward to welcoming you. Go and check out these platform features during the program breaks. Once again, my name is Ann Fischer, Senior Editor at PV Magazine USA, and this was our first session of the Roundtables US 2023. See you back after the short break for our second session, Cell and Module Production at 11 a.m. Eastern.